Hello, my name is Scott Stransky and I lead the Cyber Risk Intelligence Center at MarshMcLennan, and I'm here to share a bit about how we quantify the cost of cyber risk. And we do this using a lot of insurance data and other data sources that I'll talk about throughout this presentation. At the end, I'll have a QR code where you can reach out to me if you're interested in seeing some of the studies that I'm going to reference throughout the presentation. We're very happy to share those. We're also happy to share a copy of these slides with you afterwards if you reach out. So here's today's agenda. I will start by talking about the cyber data spectrum, the types of cyber data that exists for building models and quantifying cyber risk. We will then show some examples of quantifying cyber in terms of correlations between cyber incidents and questionnaire data, outside-in data, and dark web data. At the end, I have a brief summary and some conclusions where I'll try to bring the whole thing together. So first, let's start with the cyber data spectrum. These are the types of data that are being used to quantify risk for your organization, your peers' organizations, and really any organization out there that's interested in modeling cyber risk. And it starts on the left side with what we call firmographics. Now, firmographics are the basics about a company. These are things like its revenue, its industry, how many employees it has, and even its geographical location. The geographical location is important because there are different regulations for cyber in different parts of the world. Revenue and industry tend to be some of the biggest drivers of risk. Larger companies tend to have higher risk than smaller companies, and different industries, say education or finance, will tend to be at higher risk than others like agriculture or mining. Now, firmographics alone are things you can get from public places on the internet. You can estimate these values. They're reasonably easy to source. But as we move towards the right side of the spectrum, it becomes harder and harder to collect information on this type of data. So the next thing we look at is incident data. Now, incident data is historical cyber events that may have impacted companies like yours. And there's a few places to get these. Certainly insurance claims, which is what I will talk about quite a bit in this presentation. But there are public sources for this data as well, including news articles, Freedom of Information Act requests, and more. Now, if you just look at the news articles and Freedom of Information Act requests, it will be somewhat biased. It's biased towards bigger companies, towards English-speaking companies, towards companies based in the US. And those biases make it difficult to build a reliable model that'll work for really any company that we're interested in looking at. So that's where insurance claims data become very, very important. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide and why that is so important. Then we get to outside-in data. This is data where you're in the public part of the internet looking at a company from the outside. You don't need the company's permission to do this. They don't even necessarily know that it's happening. It's unobtrusive. And there are two different types that we're looking at here. And I'll get into a lot more detail of this as we go through this presentation. But these are things like ratings, where they're looking at your patching from the outside, open ports that they can discover, really anything that they can see from the outside. And the other type is dark web data. Now, dark web data is, again, it's public. It's in sketchy places of the internet that most employees are probably not going to go, but it's looking at things like credentials that are out there for sale by bad actors. And one of the things that we've done is try to see how correlated this is with cyber risk. And I'll show an example of that as we go through the presentation. Then we get to inside-out data. Now, for inside-out data, you do need the permission of a company. And this includes things like questionnaires, for example, a cyber insurance application questionnaire, or scans, where you could install a hardware or a software scan within a company's perimeter, and it allows us to collect more detailed information about what's going on inside the company's network. Now, with questionnaires, there's a lot of these questionnaires out there, and I'll show some examples of how the answers to these questions are correlated with cyber risk in a few minutes. Scans are relatively newer, and we don't have enough data to do a full correlation exercise. That said, some cyber insurance companies are starting to offer discounts for companies that are willing to do these types of scans on their network. They're trying to incentivize capturing this type of data so that they can then see if it actually is correlated with risk going forward. And that brings us to loss modeling on the far right side. This allows us to really quantify the cyber risk to your organization in terms of dollars or pounds or yen or euros. And there are two main forms of loss modeling. The first is what we call attritional, and the second is what we call CAT or catastrophe. Now, attritional loss modeling is looking at risk to a single organization from an attack that was targeted or aimed at that particular organization or unintentionally hit that one organization. Whereas CAT or catastrophe events span many companies at the same time. Perhaps a single point of failure like a cloud went down, taking multiple companies with it. And if you combine all of these things across the spectrum, you get a complete analytics view of risk about an organization. And this is really what we do as we're looking at risks. For those who don't know about what we do, we are a cyber insurance broker. So we're not actually taking on any risk ourselves. Instead, we're advising our clients on types of insurance to buy or cyber mitigations that they should be putting into place, which is why we actually can span all of these different categories of cyber data. So I mentioned insurance data, and being a broker, that puts us in a very unique place where we see cyber data across multiple insurance companies because we work with lots of different insurance companies. And in fact, we tend to be the first stop for many companies when they suffer an incident. They'll come to us, and we're then responsible for sharing information about the claim with each of the carriers, the cyber insurance carriers, in a program. So why is insurance data really useful for doing studies about cyber losses? Well, first of all, it's an unbiased data set. Our view, and we think it's a reasonable view, is if you spent the money to buy cyber insurance and you suffer an incident, you're going to want to collect on your claim. So therefore, for the smaller set of companies that have cyber insurance, it's really not a biased data set. Unlike some of the data I mentioned on the previous slide, where it's biased towards bigger companies or English-speaking companies, here people around the world are buying cyber insurance. And again, for that set of companies that buy it, it's not biased. It is globally covered, so it's not limited to English-speaking countries. It's not limited to the US. It's not limited to publicly traded companies. It's truly a global data set. And there's also a high fidelity in reported incidents. So you don't know, oh, there was an incident and that's it. We'll actually get details on the incident, what led to that incident, what mitigations were in place, and perhaps what mitigations they wish were in place that perhaps could have prevented the incident. So using insurance data for the studies that I'm going to share here is quite a critical component of what we do here at MarshMcLennan. Now, what are these studies I'm about to tell you about? Well, taking the insurance data, we can test, literally put to the test, effectively any third-party data set about cyber risk. We can see if it's correlated with companies suffering an incident. We do this using a blind study methodology that I'll explain in a few minutes. Before we get there, I wanted to talk a bit about the types of cyber models that are out there. I already mentioned CAT and attritional, but that's just one way to slice and dice these models. We can also think about the models in terms of deterministic versus probabilistic. Now, if you're not familiar with what those words mean, that's fine. What a deterministic model says is, if this event happens, here's how much it might cost my organization. It's very useful for what-if scenarios. On the other hand, probabilistic models say, well, here's the event, how much it'll cost my organization, but how likely is that event to even happen? Is it something that we expect to happen every few years, every decade or two, every 100 years, or is it a 1 in 1,000 year event that's really quite unlikely, but still plausible? This allows us to build better risk-informed decisions. For example, do I need to buy insurance? If this event is a 1 in a million event, maybe I don't need to insure against it. On the other hand, if the event is a 1 in 5 or 1 in 2 event, I need to probably do more than just buy insurance. Certainly I should buy insurance, but maybe I need to get some cyber mitigation techniques in place to try to avoid this event in the first place. Now, within probabilistic, I already mentioned attritional and CAT. Those are two major families of events. Within attritional, these are things like a ransomware attack, a data breach, BI, meaning business interruption, that hits a certain company. Under CAT, there's a lot of different things that could happen here. Generally, it's a single aggregation point that impacts lots of companies at once. This could be a cloud, a mass data breach, a power outage, utility failure, lots of different ways you can get a CAT event. Now, I'm going to mostly focus on the left side, the attritional side, during this presentation, for a few reasons. One is we have the most data about attritional risk. There have been a lot of incidents, a lot of claims for attritional cyber events. CAT, there have been a few CATs. In fact, we like to refer them as kitty cats, kind of small CAT events. But we haven't seen a major cloud provider go down for several days, leading to kind of the big one. Think about it in terms of, say, hurricanes. We've seen a minor hurricane, but we haven't seen Hurricane Katrina of cyber just yet. Doesn't mean we won't. And in fact, there are models for these cat events, but they're not built on as much data as the attritional models. That's why I'm going to focus on attritional here today. So the first study that I wanted to share with you all is about cyber controls. So if any of you have applied for cyber insurance, you're familiar with a questionnaire that you have to fill out. Some of you may think it's a tedious questionnaire or a very long questionnaire. Others may actually think it doesn't get detailed enough to be useful. So I'm going to try to dispel some of these myths and rumors about these questionnaires and say, yes, we get it. It's not as detailed as a CISO person might actually want it to be. But from a cyber insurer's perspective, it has that right level of information. Keep in mind, cyber insurers are writing thousands of policies per year, so they don't have that much time to dig into your organization's specific information. So that's why they can't get that deep. They may only have a little bit of time to look at the answers. But what we wanted to do was take the questionnaire and go question by question and see, well, which of these questions are actually correlated with having an incident. So the way that we did that is a little bit of math. You don't have to know too much math to get this part. But what we did was we took the probability you had a claim, given that you said, no, I didn't do this cyber control. So if the cyber control was MFA, multi-factor authentication, what was the odds that you had a claim, given that you don't have MFA? And then we did the opposite. What is the probability you have a claim, given that you said, yes, I do have MFA? We then divided these two things to get what we call a signal strength. And the signal strength is effectively how much more likely I am to have a claim if I just said, no, I don't do this thing, than if I actually do it. So if the signal strength, say, is 5, it means I'm 5 times more likely to have a cyber insurance loss if I don't do this thing than if I do. Now, you note I keep talking about cyber insurance losses. Again, that's because we use that data in this modeling. Cyber insurance data, as I said, is unbiased, but we think it's a good representation of cyber risk in general. There are cyber events, plenty of them, that don't cause a cyber insurance loss, but these are the events that are truly noteworthy. If they're getting to the cyber insurance carrier, they're quite noteworthy. So we think it's a very useful data set, and it's representative of cyber incidents, bigger cyber incidents as a whole. Now, I mentioned the signal strength. So what happens if the signal strength is 1? Well, that means that this question doesn't really matter at all. But what happens if the signal strength is below 1? In that case, it's typically because we didn't have enough data to inform this question properly. It could mean that the question is actually not worded properly or is actually not a good control. But in general, it means we don't have enough data. An example of this would be we have a question in our questionnaire that says, do you have physical security around your servers? So you're thinking to yourself, that's like an obvious, I better have physical security around my servers. But when we do this math, it turns out the signal strength is 0, which would imply that you should never have physical security around your servers. Of course, that's ridiculous. Doesn't make any sense. That's not the takeaway from this presentation, is to unlock your server rooms. So we wanted to dig into why it was a signal strength of 0. And it turns out we have thousands of clients who have filled out this questionnaire, but only 4 of them said no, they don't have physical security around their server. And guess what? None of those 4 companies had an issue or a claim. So if you just do this pure math, you'd get a signal strength of 0. Of course, those 4 companies were lucky. That doesn't mean that that'll always be the case if you don't have physical security. So that's a question that we effectively discarded from this study. We just didn't have enough data to properly analyze that question. Again, the takeaway is not that you should unlock your server rooms. In fact, that's the opposite of the thing that we want you to take away. The takeaway is that almost all companies have that, so you should have it too. We also got a few questions where the signal strength was really, really high, and we removed those as well, so I'll explain one of them. We had a question about cybersecurity logs and maintaining proper logs. Now, obviously, it's a good thing to do. We don't want to discourage that. But the signal strength was really high, and we didn't want clients or companies to think that all they have to do is maintain good logs. They could throw out all of their EDRs, their MFAs, they can throw out passwords and everything. That's not the intention here. So while it is very important to maintain logs, that's not the only thing. And in fact, companies that maintain good logs, probably it's a proxy of other good cybersecurity behavior. So that's another question we did remove from some of these studies, but not because it's bad, but just because we don't want people to think that's the only thing they have to do to be safe. So here are a few examples of things that we saw in our output. And again, at the end, I'll have a QR code that you can scan, and we'll send you the full report. So what we see here is the top key control has a signal strength of 5.58, so it's super important. And it says our system configuration management tools such as Active Directory enforce and redeploy configuration settings to systems. So 96% of our clients already do this, which is great. But if you're one of those 4% of companies that don't do this, and it applies to you, there's some companies where this is irrelevant. For example, if you're only a Mac shop, this may not be so relevant. But if this is something that would apply to you and is relevant, and you're in that 4%, you probably should drop off this webinar now and get this implemented. I won't be offended. You can come back and watch the rest of it later, because this is a really, really critical thing to do. In fact, I've given this talk at places like Black Hat and other seminars, and I always say, people, you should leave if you don't have this implemented, get this fixed. Nobody ever leaves. Maybe it's self-selecting that the people at Black Hat already do this, but I'm quite serious. The data strongly supports that this is a very, very important cyber control. Now, if you look at the fifth one here at the bottom about patching, you'll note that it may not be the most intuitive or obvious patching thing that you might imagine. So CVSS goes up to 10, and here we're looking at just patching of the 7.0s to 8.9s. So these are the second tier vulnerabilities, and you have to patch those within 7 days. We actually studied different lengths. 7 days was the most critical. We see it's super important, but we also see that only 24% of our clients have this done. So this is an area where most of the people listening to this probably do have an opportunity to improve their cybersecurity quite significantly by patching these vulnerabilities. Now you may wonder, why isn't it the 9.0s and above? Well, those tend to be patched much faster, and the bad actors know this, so they're not able to exploit them as well. Whereas the 7.0s to 8.9s, clearly only 24% are patching them within 7 days. The bad actors see that, and they realize if we can exploit these things, most places that we're going to try to attack won't be protected and they can get in. So this is a true area of most companies have some room for improvement here. So we've tried to boil down all the controls into a single graph, and that's what we're looking at here. So along the horizontal axis, we see the revenue of a company, and along the vertical axis, we see something called the modifier. Now, what does this mean? Well, the revenue is pretty obvious, but the modifier says, if I'm 1, I'm like my peer companies, exactly like my peers by industry and revenue. But if I get above 1, I'm not doing so well. I have higher risk, higher frequency of cyber incidents. So if you look at $1 billion right in the middle of this chart, that top blue line says, I implement all my cybersecurity controls poorly. I have the worst CISO in the world, terrible IT team, they're incompetent people. I've answered all the cyber controls questions negatively. Basically what it's saying is you have a 40% higher risk of having a cyber incident. On the other hand, the best case modifier at the bottom says I have the best CISO, the best team, the best software, technology, etc. I brought my risk down from 1 to 0.8. So 20% fewer incidents are going to happen to me than my peers. So effectively what this is saying is that a CISO's team is really responsible for the difference between the upper blue line and the lower blue line. It's about 45% of the risk is controllable by the CISO and the CISO's team, which is great. You have a lot of control, and hopefully you all are closer to the bottom blue line than the top blue line. But what is this actually saying? It's saying that the CISO's team also has a lot of that risk that they cannot control below that lower blue line. So what does this mean? There's a few choices. One is you can accept that risk. You can just deal with it. Some companies are willing to do that. Or you can transfer it to the insurance world. And this is really why cyber insurance exists. Because even if you have the best technology, the best team, the best software, the best hardware, you still have risk that cannot be eliminated. And that's where cyber insurance becomes quite critical. I'm sure many of you on the call already have cyber insurance, so your lower blue line is reduced because you have cyber insurance. While you may have an event, it won't cost your company because it'll be covered by cyber insurance. The other thing to note is that it's a funnel shape going from left to right. So on the left side, for smaller companies, there's a bigger gap between worst controls and best controls. What does that mean? Well, we've speculated that the bad actors do more of a scattershot approach for these small companies. And if your controls are not in place properly, well, it means that they're going to be able to get in with their scattershot approach. On the other hand, if your controls are in place, they're probably not going to bother with you because you're a small company and not really valuable to the bad actor. On the other hand, on the right side, well, these are the huge companies, and it's not a scattershot approach at all. In fact, the bad actors tend to specifically target many of these companies. So if that first control is locked down really well, they'll try the second one or third one to get in. That's why on a percentage basis, at least, the controls matter more for smaller companies. Of course, in an absolute dollar amount, it matters a lot more on the right side. Don't get me wrong. But just on a percentage basis, it matters more for the smaller companies. And I'll have a couple more of these charts as we go through the rest of the presentation. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about briefly is outside data from third parties. These are companies that do outside-in ratings that you may be familiar with from some of your own vendors or some vendors that have tried to sell their services to you, and then also dark web data. So the way that we did this is we asked each of these vendors to share with us all their historical incident data going back about 6 years. And it was a blind test because we didn't tell them which companies we cared about that had a claim versus those that did not have a claim. And we were able to then join this historical data to our data before the claim happened. We wanted to see what we would have seen from these vendors leading up to the claim, not after the claim because it's too late. And we wanted to see if there was a correlation there. So in the next slide, I'll show you some correlations from these vendors, and it's using something called a rank by serial correlation. That may not mean anything to you, that's okay. What you need to know is that correlation goes from -1 to 1. And in our case, -1 is good, meaning higher scores are correlated with lower breaches. So negative is good. And if we got a -1 correlation, actually we could also cancel this webinar. You all could be out of your jobs because there would be no purpose for anything that any of us do because you'd have this score that perfectly predicts whether you'd have a cyber incident. Luckily, your job is safe. We are not close to -1. That said, it's also not 0. There is some value in these outside-in scores. So what we're looking at here are from 2 public papers that we've done. And since it is public, I can share that the one in the upper left is from BitSite, and then the one in the lower right is from Security Scorecard. Again, I can send you links to these papers if you scan the QR code at the end. And what we see here are those correlation values for some of the sub-scores that BitSite and Security Scorecard provide. And we can see that the BitSite patching cadence score in the upper left is the one that has the highest correlation, the best correlation with risk. It's about -0.3. So again, it's not -1, your jobs are safe, but it is not 0 either. So some of the things we hear is, oh, these scores are completely useless. They're not completely useless. There is value in these scores. Some of you who have taken a statistics course may be familiar with something called R-squared. And if you do that here, you get about 10%. So what does that mean? It means that the BitSite patching cadence score explains about 10% of what's going on in breach frequency. So again, it's not 0. It's also not even close to 100%. So our view is that these are useful tools as part of a model, but these should not be the only model. And that's indeed how we've applied them in our own work. So as we think about quantifying cyber risk, we absolutely account for scores like this in a small way within our cyber loss model. And this chart kind of brings that home. So this is equivalent to the chart I showed before, where we have the very best at the bottom, and the very worst at the top in orange. And we see here, compared to the cyber controls in a few slides ago, this is a narrower funnel, meaning while it is still important to have good outside-in scores, it doesn't matter quite as much as having good cybersecurity controls. And I think that hopefully is intuitive to everybody here, that the CISO and their team control more of the risk than looking at a very good or very bad outside-in score. Okay, the third data set that I'd like to look at is dark web data. And again, this is a public report, so I can share this is with a vendor called Searchlight Cyber. And what we did with Searchlight is we wanted to understand in the 9 places on the dark web that they looked, those are these things listed here, clients, credentials, exits, etc. If they found something about our client, did that make you more likely to have a cyber incident than if they didn't? So that's what we're looking at in the second column of the chart on the right, has finding. So Y means they found our client information in one of these 9 places, N means they did not. We actually looked at how many things they found. Turns out that didn't matter so much. It was simply whether they found something or not. And then we see the cyber insurance loss rate in the third column in the table. And we can see for every single Y, it's a higher cyber insurance loss rate than N. Meaning if they found something in the dark web about your organization, you had a higher chance of having an incident over the next year. Again, this is looking a year before the incident. So we found this data to be quite correlated with risk. And there's a few other things I'd like to point out here. So first is credentials. You may be thinking, if they found credentials of your company in the dark web, haven't we already been breached? The answer is no. It means maybe one of your employees used their work email address and password on an online shopping site or a news site or some other site, and that site was breached. Now these records are for sale, but it does not mean your company has actually suffered an incident yet, which is why you see these cyber insurance loss rates are all single-digit percentages. They're not even double-digit percentages. That said, if you look at those sample sizes, about 90% of our clients actually have credentials out there in the dark web. But if you're in one of those 10% or so that do not, your cyber insurance loss rate is less than half. It goes down from 4.78% to 1.87%. So that is a really important and significant difference just by not having stuff out there for sale in the dark web. You can see the opposite's true for Telegram. Most of our clients, well over 90%, are not being discussed in Telegram channels on the dark web, which is fair. But for those few percent who are being discussed, your cyber insurance loss rate is almost double. It goes from 4.28% up to 7.47%. Again, these are things that are super significant and correlated with your risk of suffering an incident. So what does this mean for you? If I have a Y here, is that the end of the world? Am I out of luck? The answer is no. There are actually things you can do. So the most obvious thing is if John Doe's credentials are out there on the dark web, you can reset John Doe's password immediately, maybe do some training for John Doe. All sorts of stuff like that can be done and actually prevent one of these cyber insurance incidents or an incident in general from happening. There are other things that you can do that would require a little more detailed stuff. For example, you'd have to get your lawyer's permission to do this. But if bad actors are selling records in the dark web, you can actually buy them. It sounds a little strange, but the bad actors tend to only sell these records one time. And if you buy them from the bad actor, they're not going to sell them again because the bad actors know once they're sold once, the records lose a lot of their value. So if you as an organization decide you want to buy them, again, you need your lawyer's permission. Don't just do this on your own. Get your legal team's permission. You buy them, you're actually taking them off the market. Of course, there's a lot of legal and ethical things that go along with that because you're sponsoring bad actors, all these things, but it is a way that you could potentially prevent a breach at your company now that you know that this data is available to the bad actors. You can kind of shut it down before it gets out. Again, I'm not suggesting whether you should or should not do it. I'm just saying it is a way you can prevent incidents. And this is the equivalent chart that I've shown two others before for all of these things combined. And we can see it's actually the widest funnel because we're looking at the impact of lots of different things together. The fact that your data has been breached in the dark web, all of these things, it shows the widest signal. But again, that lower blue line is not close to zero, which is why you still need to either accept the rest of that risk or transfer it away to the insurance world. Okay, so before I conclude, I wanted to put the whole thing together and really show you what the insurers are looking for. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we at Marsh, we're not an insurer, we're a broker. So our job is to support our clients, you all, as you're working through the insurance process. And these are the 12 things that we have seen to be most critical to getting the best possible insurance policy. By best, I mean lowest premium, best coverage, fewest restrictions, most endorsements, all of these things. It's everything from MFA to email filtering to supply chain risk management. Again, I'm not going to read through all of these things. You're happy to take a screenshot, go for it. And also, as I said in a second, I'll show you a QR code where you can request all of the reports that I've talked about here. And I'll send you an email with all of them and also these slides. So speaking of the QR code, here is that QR code. You also can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, but use this code to get a copy of our studies. So while we're on this last slide, I will leave you with a cyber joke because I always like to include at least one cyber joke in my presentations. And hopefully that'll encourage you to scan the QR code while we're here. I was with a colleague the other day and he was logging into his computer. And it seemed like he was typing a lot of stuff to get into the computer. So I asked him, why is your password so long? And he actually told me what his password was, which of course is not a good idea to do. But he said his password was Snoopy, James Bond, Mickey Mouse, on and on and on, Sacramento. I thought that was a little strange. So I actually asked him why that was his password. And he said, well, they told me it had to be at least 8 characters and a capital. So I don't know if any of you are laughing. I can't see your faces. Hopefully you're laughing or maybe groaning a little bit. But with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time here. Again, feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk more about cyber quantification. And again, thank you so much for your time and watching this presentation. Have a great day.